Hey, this is John, and this is the first video in a series of tutorials that's going to be teaching you how you can get models, among other assets, into Source Filmmaker. And this process can apply to other games that are built on Source, as the process is fairly similar, save a few things. So let's go ahead and get started here. This is the first video, and it's kind of an introduction. It's going to be talking about the general process because I feel it important that you understand kind of the overall view of how this process works, as well as what programs and tools are necessary, and there'll be links in the description for those. So first things first are the programs you will need, and they'll be, again, in the description. There's a folder you can download that has all of them that you will need. And a quick rundown is VTF Edit. That's for the like textures and materials. And then there's wall worm tools for 3ds Max. So if you don't use 3ds Max, you don't need to worry about this one. But this basically lets you export models to the proper format from 3ds Max. Blender source tools. So if you're using Blender, as I've found most people are for this process, then you'll need to install just the Blender source tools. And then there's Crowbar, which is the compiler API or UI, or I'm not exactly sure what they call it, but basically it's just the front end for using the compiler, and the compiler itself is inside of Source Filmmaker. It's just going to be using that to compile the necessary files into the final format, which is an MDL. So let's go ahead and get started here. I have on my desktop, I've arranged these icons to help me illustrate the process of what's going to be going on here. And again, this is just an introduction. I'm going to be going over what the general process is so that you hopefully have a better understanding of it as we move along. So basically, you start out with your program like Blender or 3ds Max, and you create your model inside of that program, right? And then you'll also probably, if you're doing it yourself, you'll have textures that you'll create in, you know, if you can paint it or whatever, but it always comes out to be some sort of format like a PNG or a target or something, and that kind of stuff you can edit inside of Photoshop and GIMP and so on. And then what happens is from Blender or 3ds Max, you'll use those plugins to export either a DMX or an SMD. Now this is a format, basically think of an OBJ, right? An OBJ contains model information. Now an SMD and a DMX, basically same sort of thing. It's a container that contains information about the model, and that, you know, that's the model geometry data, the normals, the rig or armature, and blend shapes, stuff like that. Now, the difference I'm going to mention right now between DMX and SMD is that DMX comes out to be a smaller file size, which is nice. DMX is newer, and DMX natively supports blend shapes where SMD does not, but we'll get into the finer details of these two later. And then down here we have a VMT and a VTF. That's basically a valve material and a valve texture format, right? So what are these two? Well, think of a VTF as just another image format, right? So you have, say, you have a texture that's a PNG. Well, you can take that PNG into this program called VTF Edit, and that will convert it into a VTF. And a VTF is basically just, you know, it's a PNG, or, you know, any of those formats. It converts it into a VTF, and that's the format that Valve uses, okay? That's all it is, really simple. And see if I open up here. So VTF Edit is just this program. Basically, you can import images, you drop them in, and it will convert them into VTFs. Now, there is one thing you probably need to know about this, and that's that images you import into this need to be, the resolution needs to be in a power of 2. So the image needs to be like 512, or, you know, 1024. It doesn't need to be square. The resolutions just need to be in powers of 2. So it could be like 2048 by 1024, yada yada yada. That should make sense. Again, we'll go into more detail about this program later, but it's pretty simple. It's a pretty simple program. And then from VTF Edit, you'll be able to create VMTs, which is basically a script. It's a really simple script, which tells basically the compiler what the material is going to look like, and as well as what the name of the material is. And that's important that you name it the same thing as you have in Blender material, because that way it lets it know which material belongs to, you know, which surface. So that's, you know, that's pretty simple to get your head wrapped around. But basically, this is just a script. You'll be putting in the textures, you'll be putting in properties, and defining kind of properties of the shader, stuff like that. And again, we'll get into this later on. And I'm working on a template for VMTs that should make it really easy for people to get into. So that's basically VMT, VTF kind of wrapped up. And again, you'll need that program VTF edit to take care of that stuff. And all of these programs are really quite small, so it's no hassle. So once you have these, these things here that are set up, you'll need to create what's called a QC file, and you can do that just in Notepad. But a QC file is another script. Again, it's a simple script, and I'm working on a template that should make it really easy for people to get into. Basically, this QC script, all it does is it tells the compiler which files to use, where those files are located, and then it gives it certain parameters to compile it with. Alright, and that's really all there is to a QC in a nutshell. Also, you can incorporate things like animations into QC. So if you create an animation, say in Blender, you can export the animation with the DMX or SMD, and you can incorporate that into the MDL itself. So when you put it into Source Filmmaker and you go and search for animation sequences, you'll be able to find those and import them, which is very useful if you're doing more complex animations with your model that aren't otherwise possible in Source Filmmaker as far as rigs with constraints go. So yeah, that's pretty much all a QC is. Again, you can create that just in Notepad. Notepad plus it's just basically a nicer version of Notepad, but you don't need it, so that's all fine. And then there's Crowbar, right? So Crowbar is, like I said, it's just the front end for the compiler that you can download, and it's definitely the best one out there. So let me just open up this program and give you a quick preview of what this is. So you can compile models in here, and you can also decompile models in here, and we'll get into all of that in its own given video. But the compiler, really, all you got to do is you search for the QC file that you've created, and you push compile. It's really all there is to it. And then if you've written the the QC out properly, and all the models are there's no problems with those, then the model will compile out just fine. And if there are any error messages, it'll tell you. Sometimes the error messages are not too specific, but we'll get into common things that happen. So yeah, that's really all there is to it. And then up here you can choose a mod, right? So this not only lets you compile into Source Filmmaker, but to other Source games such as Left 4 Dead, but basically all that happens here, and again we'll go into this, is that you just specify a couple file paths that are specific to Source Filmmaker, and that'll just tell it, okay, so I need to put the files into Source Filmmaker specifically, and then there's this thing called a mod, which we'll get into right now. So what's a mod? Oh, man, my throat is... There we go. So a mod is basically a folder inside of Source Filmmaker that just contains, a bunch of assets, and the purpose of it is to be able to let Source Filmmaker find those assets and use them. So if you ever used Source Filmmaker and you search for something, all of those files, all of those models, they're inside a mod folder. And for, just a general user like me or you, if we're creating or importing models, they have a mod folder called usermon, which is set up for us to use to put our models into. And so inside of every mod, including usermod, there are going to be two folders called models and materials. And the models will always go in the models folder, and the compiler will assume that that's where they go. And the materials always go in the materials folder, and that's where the compiler is going to assume that these go. And so basically, when the compiler runs and it creates the MDL, which is the final compiled version of the model that Source Filmmaker can use, it'll put it into the models folder, and you'll want to specify a subfolder of the models folder, just for organizational purposes, and that's very important. You want to be organized. And then same thing goes for materials, and what you'll want to do here is inside the QC you'll specify where the materials are located, and again, it's assuming it's inside the materials folder, so you'll just specify a subfolder in there. And then you'll want to go to that subfolder, and you want to take the VMT and the VTF files, and you want to drop them into that folder so that the compiled MDL has access to these. Otherwise, if you go into SFM, you'll get an error texture, which is basically just a bunch of black and purple or pink squares, and that'll say, oh, the texture is missing. So if you put everything in the right place, you won't have that, and it'll come out just fine. So that was a basic rundown of what happens here, and again, I just wanted you to understand the overall process. As we move along, it should help you, and we're going to be going over, each step in detail as to how you can get a model into Source Filmmaker with, the given textures, stuff like that. We'll also go over certain other things like how you can get animated textures in, as well as certain stuff about rigs and blend shapes and animations. So this is a pretty comprehensive guide, but I'm going to keep it pretty simple. I'm going to explain everything really well, and I'm going to try and keep these videos from going over 10 minutes. Now I'm over 10 minutes right now. I'm about 10:40 something, and it's about time to end this video, So yeah, that's this video, kind of wrapping everything up in a nutshell for you before we move on. In the next video, we're going to go over how the mods and the file paths work in Source Filmmaker. That way we know how we can get the file path set up for compiling, stuff like that. So thanks for watching. My name's John, and if you like this video, go ahead and give it a like, then subscribe to my channel to see more, and go ahead and watch the next video in this series. Thanks. I'll see you in the next one.